Hello and welcome back to Classics 170, Beach House Edition. So in our last lecture we talked about the kind of guy Aeneas is, and now I'd like to talk about the events of Book 4 of the Aeneid and what they have to do with actual Roman history. And specifically, what does Book 4 have to say about Rome's relationship with Carthage and the three wars the Romans fought against that state? So this is Aeneid, Book 4, the tragedy of Dido and what that has to do with the real Carthage. Carthage was first settled in the year 814 BCE by settlers from Tyre. So people from over here settled a city over here in 814. Their founder was a legendary character named Elissa. However, the Libyans called her Dido, which means in their language, the wanderer. She is said to have tricked the locals into giving her quite a bit of land in the following way. She told them that she would take as much land as she could enclose in an ox hide. So she cut an ox hide into extremely fine strips of cord and wound it around an area that took its name from the ox hide. So the city of Carthage was also called Bursa, which was the local word for ox hide. Also, in the modern calculus of variations, the problem of how to enclose the maximum amount of space with a fixed boundary is still referred to as the Dido problem. Fun fact, in the oldest traditions of her story, she escaped having to marry into the royal house of a local king by leaping onto a burning pyre and killing herself. Virgil then did not invent the idea that Aeneas, a character who lived in the time of the Trojan War, met Dido, who would have lived hundreds of years later. He did, however, come up with the idea that Aeneas and Dido had an affair, and that she killed herself over him. Back to real Carthage. Its economy would be driven by trade, and they would later come to be competitors with their mother city of Tyre. And over time, the Carthaginians were to build a massive trading empire. In the year 509, the same year that the Romans kick out the Etruscan kings, a treaty was signed between Rome and Carthage stating that commercial activity could be divided between them amicably, and there wouldn't be any trouble. However, all good things come to an end. In the year 264, a war started between the Romans and the Carthaginians, called the First Punic War. The cause of this war was that the Romans wished to expand their power into Sicily, the island here off the tip of the toe of the boot of Italy. And at this time, Sicily was held at least partly by the Carthaginians. The Romans would win this war, but only through some fantastic efforts. Ultimately, it would bring Rome Sicily, Corsica, Sardinia, and these were big victories. Rome was able to extract humiliating treaty upon the Carthaginians, which made them pay an enormous yearly tribute to them, as kind of a tax for them staying away. Also, the Romans learned how to fight at sea with the innovation of a new thing called the corvus, which is Latin for crow, which allowed their soldiers to board enemy ships and take them. And here we have an image of what an ancient Roman Carthaginian warship would look like. Up until this point in time, the way naval warfare had worked was they would ram the pointy end of the ship over here into the side of the enemy's ship, causing the enemy's ship to sink. It's kind of like using a ship like a torpedo. And this is pretty effective. However, it's kind of dangerous because while you're trying to pull your ship out of the other guy's ship, there's a chance you could die in the process. Also, it's just plain wasteful. These ships are very expensive. What if we came up with an invention like the corvus that would actually allow you to throw a bridge down onto the ship you were trying to take? You would send your marines across, kill all the bad guys, and take the ship for yourself. Well, the Romans invented this, and did really well in this war as a result. What are some major figures in this war? The major Carthaginian figure is a king named Hamilcar Barcas. And the major Roman general for this war, this is the general that turned Romans into sailors, was a fellow by the name of Regulus. This war ends in 241, and what does that mean? That means that this war was very long. Actually means this is a 23-year war that had pretty bad consequences for both sides. The Romans came out on top, and the Carthaginians caught the worst of it. One of the biggest problems with the way the war ended was that there was no way the Carthaginians could actually pay the tribute that was expected of them every single year in order to keep the Romans out of their hair. And the Carthaginians became impoverished over this. Well, this would ultimately lead to the Second Punic War, which started in 218. And this started when the son of Hamilcar Barcas, a man by the name of Hannibal, chose to invade the Roman Empire during the winter. And he chose to do this as retribution for what the Romans had done to them in the First War. So what did he do? He did something amazing. He actually brought his entire army over into Europe here at the Straits of Gibraltar and led them in the middle of the winter over the Alps and into Rome's back door, where Rome never would have seen them coming. And how did he do this? He did this in the most fantastical way imaginable. Hannibal used elephants, kind of like tanks, in his army, and actually brought elephants over the Alps. Now, a word of clarification on this, like how did he use elephants? He used elephants like tanks as fighting animals. You generally have an archer on top, and the elephant was trained to stamp on enemy soldiers and generally scare the bejesus out of them. Horses, as it turns out, are terrified of elephants and have a hard time fighting against them if they've never seen them before. Romans, who'd only heard of elephants but never seen them, regarded them as monsters and were terrified. Hannibal was able to really cause some trouble for the Romans in the Italian peninsula. He trashed the Italian peninsula for 9 years with his elephants. Oh, one more thing about the elephants. What kind of elephants are they? Are they elephants from Africa or from India? It would only make sense that they would be elephants from Africa. After all, Hannibal lived in Africa. How are you going to get African elephants from the wild into North Africa through the Sahara Desert? The answer is you're not. Also, African elephants have never been tamed and used for any kind of labor. However, the Indians have been doing it for thousands. So, Hannibal had Indian elephants imported from India all the way to Carthage that he would use to fight against the Romans. Talk about globalization. How would it go for Hannibal? Not well. He trashed the Italian peninsula for 9 years, but eventually ran out of money, and he had to come back and eventually face the Romans when they confronted him on his home soil. And he was defeated by them at the Battle of Zama in 202. The war would end shortly thereafter, with Carthage becoming a city-state, essentially. However, he wouldn't die. He fled off to Asia Minor, where he lived at the client king of the Persian court, and later killed himself in 183. Still, he lived on as an important figure in the minds of Romans. For them, he was kind of like the devil, the boogeyman, and Osama bin Laden all rolled into one, because he could strike at them where they lived, and he can do so with impunity. The other major figure from this war is a Roman figure, a fellow by the name of Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus. And he was a great general, and he famously won the Battle of Zama, putting the boogeyman of Hannibal to bed forever. So, I said that the Carthaginians were greatly weakened in this. However, it wasn't over for them. Eventually, due to the agitation of a man who had lived through the Second Punic War, a man named Cato the Censor, the Romans would get it together and go to war with the Carthaginians one more time. And in 149 BCE, they did so, finally defeating the Carthaginians for good in 146. Carthage is annexed, and Africa becomes a province of the Roman Empire. Cato famously said, Ceterum censeo Carthaginem esse delendam, or Carthago delenda est. And this means Carthage must be destroyed. Carthage must be destroyed. And this was the tool of rhetoric he used to convince the people of Rome, at the end of every single speech he made, that they needed to go to war and make this happen. Well, what does this have to do with the Aeneid? It has this to do with the Aeneid. Aeneas, sailing from Sicily, shows up on the shores of Carthage. At first he's taken in by Dido and treated very well by her. So well that the gods hatch a plot. Of course they do. Juno and Venus, Aeneas' mother, hatch a plot whereby Aeneas and Dido get together and share their resources and begin building a city together. But wait, Aeneas is destined to go elsewhere. Well, that doesn't stop Aeneas and Dido from sleeping together in a cave. Dido will think of this as marriage. Aeneas will think of it as them getting together and then later shacking up. However, he still does help out with building her city, until one day when Mercury comes to him and says that he's whipped and needs to move on, not just for the sake of his own ambitions, but also for the sake of his family and for that of his people. This will cause Dido to go into a tailspin. As Aeneas is sailing away, she'll kill herself. And how will she do it? She'll do it on top of a funeral pyre, constructed out of the bed she shared with Aeneas, and all of his armor, and she'll actually kill herself with a sword that belonged to him. Kind of over the top, kind of intense, not unlike Medea. But let's look at the character of Dido for a minute. What kind of lady is she? She's a bit like Nausicaa in that she takes in Aeneas when he's down and protects him. She's a bit like Circe in that she's an enchantress. She actually does use a bit of magic, and Aeneas stays with her for quite some time, nearly a year. She's a bit like Calypso in that she's powerful. She's upset when a man that she saved from the sea leaves because it's the will of the gods. And she's a bit like Medea in that she's from the east, and her reaction to her man's betrayal is way over the top. So here's an image of Aeneas leaving Carthage in his ships. Let's get back to this intertextuality thing. While there are several references to Bacchus and the worship of Bacchus, when he first mentions Dido's reaction to Aeneas' secret attempts to leave in this poem, we actually get a sense that Virgil is referencing works of literature in particular when he's describing Dido's situation. And the first example of this is like mad Pentheus when he sees the Maenads and sees a double sun and duplicate Thebes. This isn't just like the Bacchae. This is actually a reference to the Bacchae and a scene in the Bacchae where Pentheus starts to go crazy and hallucinate. Next, we get a reference to Eumenides in the same bit, or like Orestes stalked by the Furies on an empty stage, pursued by his mother with torches and snakes while the avenging fiends lurk in the doorway. And this is a reference to Aeschylus' Eumenides. Also, Dido begins to talk like Medea and do Medea-like things when she talks about what she should have done when Aeneas and his men arrived on our shores. Do you feel guilt? Better to have felt it when you gave away your crown. Hold the pledge, the loyalty of a man they say bears his ancestral gods, bore on his shoulders his age-worn father. Could I have not torn him limb from limb and fed him to the fishes, murdered his friends, minced Ascanius himself, and served him up as a meal to his father? So here she talks about the possibility of murdering everyone but Aeneas and making him feel bad and knowing that this has happened, just like what Medea did to Jason. And the last example I can think of is the curse that she utters against Aeneas when he's leaving the city. And it's very much like the one that Polyphemus calls down on Odysseus' head in the Odyssey. Oh, hear my prayer. If this criminal is destined to make harbor again, which we know Aeneas is, and if this is what the fates in Jupiter demand, may he still have to fight a warlike nation. He will. Be driven from his land and torn from Iülus. He will. May he plead for aid and see his people slaughtered. He will. And when he has accepted an unjust peace, he will. May he not enjoy his reign over the light of day, but die before his time and lie unburied on a desolate shore. I can't speak to the last part, but every other part of this comes true. So it seems that Dido is able to utter prophecy just like Polyphemus in the Odyssey. And it all exists within the realm of what the fates and the gods have already decreed. And she's aware of it. That's how it works. What's the purpose of this? Why are there so many references to works that you have already read? Well, some would say it's just that Virgil is complimenting you on how well read you are. But there's more to it than that. Is Dido really like Pentheus from the Bacchae? Well, she hasn't committed any kind of outrage against a god or denied a god's existence. Why is she hallucinating? Well, she's under the spell of a god, but she's under the spell of love. So you're supposed to notice the tension between love and Bacchus here. Well, what about Orestes? Orestes murdered his mother and was being chased around. Here she isn't being chased around by the Furies. She's being chased around by the demons of her own guilt and the way she feels slighted. When she threatens Aeneas, saying Medea-like things, she talks about what she should have done, not what she actually did. Unlike Medea, Dido won't turn all of her aggression and anger on the rest of the world. She'll turn it on herself. And there's a tension between these two things that you're supposed to notice as a reader. Virgil's complimenting you. Finally, is she really like Polyphemus who's been wounded? Yes, she is, but in a different way. She's been emotionally wounded. And this tension between what Homer and these other authors did with their works and what Virgil is doing with his is what makes Virgil so special. Stay tuned for next lesson's lectures on Book 6 of the Aeneid and Aeneas' journey into the underworld.